Reading is the best example of a skill that we use on a daily basis and that much depends on, and yet we seldom think of practicing or improving. We'll discuss how reading fits into OptimalWork's approach, how to improve at both your speed and comprehension, and yes, how to read 60 books per year. I'm Sharif Yunus with Dr. Kevin Majors. This is the Golden Hour. Our all-new online masterclass touches on many topics related to this episode on reading, like how to focus, how to improve at any skill, and how to bring your ideals into your work. In this 4-week masterclass, available on OptimalWork.com, Dr. Majors will guide you through all the key ideas of optimal work, with exercises provided to help you master them. Now let's get started. Hey, this is Sharif here with another episode of the Golden Hour, joined by Dr. Kevin Majors. Kevin, thanks for coming back.
Sharif, great being here with you again.
Well, Kevin, I thought it would be great for us today to discuss the topic of reading, which oftentimes we approach as kind of a skill that you can get better and better at through golden hours and through refining your techniques of reading and getting better at reading or faster or understanding more. Then I think it also has implications for breaks, what you do during your breaks to connect with higher ideals. And I think it also has some bigger implications for kind of life and living a life according to ideals. So that would be a great topic for us to get into today. So I guess maybe we could just start with kind of at the highest level, the importance of reading books. So I think maybe you could provide an interesting perspective on that.
Yeah, I think reading is a kind of deliberate way of learning. And deliberate learning means that when you're engaging a text and you're reading it, you're able to think objectively about it. And you're able to kind of ask it questions. You're able to be trying to read between the lines, trying to see what are the assumptions that are built in here. And so it gives you a very deliberate way of engaging with something you can learn from. And I just want to contrast that with the opposite, which is learning by, you could say, implicit assumptions. And I think that that's like a form of coercion. You just assume that, how are you getting good ideas? How are you getting any kind of clear ideas or beliefs if you're not deliberately taking it in and assessing? Otherwise, you just kind of end up going along with the assumptions of the people you're around. So, and I think that it means is that like when you learn by an implicit assumption, you're not able to sift it out. It's just you start assuming what the people around you are assuming. So, and if everything is sound bites and really brief things that have no depth to them, you are basically going to be just absorbing the assumptions of the people around you.
Mm-hmm.
But when you actually read something that is like a longer development of an argument, I'm thinking here particularly right now of nonfiction reading, then you really get a chance to think critically about it. And I think it just gives you a lot more autonomy and deliberation.
Mm-hmm. So at some point you have to get down to what are the facts at play here? What are the arguments being made? Yeah. I guess you're alluding to reading articles. They're just opinion pieces. So more often than not, you're not actually getting to facts. You're just getting a person's opinion, and I guess people tend to read opinion pieces that they already agree with. Is that kind of a problem here?
Well, I would be okay in a sense, as long as it's explicit.
Uh-huh.
And it's clear that it's opinion versus something where it's just, there are all these assumptions that this is how we think. And I think that that's what I was saying in my mind is it more, it's just like you're basically, if you're just getting really short pieces of information or of opinion, it's just hard to engage a real argument. It's hard to think through objections because the author may not be really going through objections or addressing what are, I don't know. So I just want to start with this point when it comes to reading, that there's something different about taking a deep dive into some idea, maybe the way you would in a really good conversation. Like in a really good conversation with a good interlocutor. You're able to kind of ask questions and go back and forth and and not just have to go along with everything that's being said, but you get to deliberately kind of tease out what are the implications and how do we know this is true. I just think that reading a good book is like having a deep conversation with a famous person, usually famous. So at least in some way. Yeah, so you're able to just have an extended meeting of the mind to see how this person thinks. And I think the better the person, the better the writer, the more what is everything is kind of explicitly stated for you to freely accept or reject.
Mhm. And there's something here that, so not only are you getting the right content in the sense that you're getting the person's fully developed ideas to engage with, you're also yourself learning more how to think, which is
That's
important,
exactly right.
to think
Yeah, I
critically.
think
So
one of
it's
the most important skills people can develop is being able to not simply agree with everything they read, but to learn to kind of have an objective or critical stance. To think, okay, how do I, like, where is this person coming from? What's the history of this argument? What other kinds of arguments do people like this make? So I
mhm,
think this is just, I think it's part of having like, maybe it's like the scientist in me that you're wanting to be skeptical and you're wanting to get to the bottom of things. You're wanting to understand things in the right context. But well-written books are very upfront about all of that. And it's not all innuendo. It's actually they have explicit, they have their claims that you can accept or reject, and it's all kind of above the table.
yeah, maybe continuing on this topic, we could get into some of the areas where this intersects with our approach at Optimal Work. Why reading is kind of important from that perspective, because frankly, I think some of these reasons that we've given so far aren't exactly things that you would find like on OptimalWorks website. We don't talk a
Yeah.
lot necessarily about the importance of critical thinking ability. Of course, it is important, but it doesn't really enter into our specific approach of learning how to work well in each hour of work.
Mhm.
But one of the things that's necessary for working well is having, developed ideals. And a sense we often talk about, before you start working, you can call to mind an image of how someone you look up to or a role model or a hero would do the same task. So I think reading can be a source of those kinds of things, of those ideals and of role models. And so in many ways, reading is developing it, your kind of framework so that you can actually approach tasks in a right brained way. You can have these higher ideals that you can bring into your tasks. But without reading, where would you get that from? I guess people in your life too, but reading is a
Mhm.
good source. So I don't know if you have any other areas of
Yeah,
connection
exactly.
between
And I would just
reading.
say that this actually is one of the kind the ability to really read well and to experience reading as an interesting conversation. That's kind of what
Mhm,
we would want people to have. In my mind, that is the real, like, one of the overall purposes of education, particularly of liberal education, in the sense of liberal arts. So trying to be, this is reading literature and history and kind of what does it mean to be a more kind of learned or cultured person. So it means that you're familiar with the great works, of thought, and you're able to like engage arguments in a deep way. So there is this high level skill of that kind of critical thinking that I think any excellence in when it comes to studying and in for students, it's really important that they develop that. But then what you're getting at is as people have this ability to critically assess things, they can then they can discern better who are the people that I want, like who are the role models that I most want to emulate, rather than just accepting every example, or trying to act like this guy from a TV show that they really enjoyed, and they try to,
yeah.
I think that's a very common thing that young people do is without knowing it, they kind of start to act like the people that for some reason that they admire. And that's a normal thing. But I think when you're engaging great works and you're reading, I think then you're much more able to sift through those examples to come up with what exactly are really the right role models and what are the ideals that to me are the most worthy of my commitment. So, and again, I think there's a lot more we can talk about with reading, but I just wanted to start with this like, it should be ideally this a deep conversation with a great mind,
Mhm.
carried out at length and over multiple days usually. And so in that sense, it really is um, there is something profound about encountering another good book. So and reading a good book and then going through its arguments kind of slowly and working through it.
Yeah. I like that characterization a lot, a conversation with a great mind, because something that I can fall into sometimes is trying to get a book over with or just read it quickly.
Mhm.
And so think about it that way is like, well, why would I want to just get that over with? Conversation with a great mind is something, if anything, I would want to prolong, but obviously not
Yep.
just
I think that's
finish it quickly.
yeah, and so a really good conversation, you'd be happy to go back to it and to keep kind of plumbing its depths.
Hmm.
So the particularly if there are things that help people shape their ideals, and to clarify what matters most in life, those kind of texts they should engage as a kind of a lingering, slow conversation. So that you really let your mind be melded, be kind of molded, I guess I should say, by the experience of this other great mind that you're reading. And there are a lot of works written by, pretty incredible people, and you become more like them when you have a meeting of the mind with them.
Yeah, that's right. And well, maybe we could get now into some of the practical elements of reading, which I know you had wanted to discuss, of seeing reading as a skill that you can develop and how you go about doing that. And I guess one uh, necessary thing first is that you actually make time for it in your day.
Mhm.
So and we've done this in a previous podcast of kind of what are the sine qua nons, what are the things that you always do, you always make time for.
Mhm.
I'm not sure if we mentioned reading as being one of those, but here I would say it
Yep.
is that you make time every day for reading. But then once you actually do that, so then what do you do? How do you get better at reading? And you have some ideas about that.
Yeah, exactly. Well, first, maybe even before getting into how do you improve reading,
Hmm.
it is, in my mind, the prototype of a skill that is highly improvable that most people never think about improving.
Hmm.
So, in a lot of types of things, we just tend to get to a plateau. And once we're in the plateau, we don't reassess and set new goals for ourselves. Tennis is another good example of that, or golf. But people can kind of get comfortable playing so they can play with friends, but they aren't really working on the game and trying to shape it. Where then you have to come up with a new view of how you're doing something and then specify how you're going to be shaping with deliberate practice and then kind of apply yourself to that until you kind of master it. And when it comes to learning to play a piano song, you have to see the beauty of the whole piece and then learn how to practice the parts and you put it back together into a whole piece. And that's the classic thing of it starts with the right brain. You kind of give some of the rote practice to the left brain to get good at, and then it gets reintegrated by the right brain, just the neuroscience approach. But
Hmm.
reading is exactly like that. So one thing is, seeing um, there is a kind of, um, there's a skill that is really practicable to improve your ability to read faster and with greater comprehension. And in my mind, those two things, people often think that when they are reading fast or try reading, they don't comprehend as much.
Hmm.
I would say that's actually more like rushed reading. If you're rushing through something, you're kind of skimming and skipping. That's not really how people improve their speed. And there's a little bit of mechanics of the body involved in like how fast can we read. The uh, the human eye takes a quarter of a second to fixate on a new object. So that means that if you know, the maximum reading speed for the human eye, if you're reading one word at a time, is 240 words a minute. Because it takes a quarter of a second or 60 seconds, so 240 words a minute. Now, the average American adult has a reading speed right near 240 words a minute. So they have maximized how fast they can read, without, and so reading faster then it can't mean moving the eyes faster. And
Mhm.
and so people then skip. But that's not the right way of doing it either. It's about widening the focus to take in 2 words at a time. If you do It's the thing about that, if you could do 2 words at a time and then maximize that, you'd be reading 480 words a minute. That's a massive gain. And with a little bit of practice, allowing the eye to take in more words at once, the brain's fully capable of that. It's just that we've trained ourselves to do 1 word at a time. But really, the whole thing of spaces is kind of arbitrary anyway. The brain is capable of taking on much more than that at one time. And so that's what you end up practicing, is taking in more words. And so the best book on this is called Breakthrough Rapid Reading by Peter Kump. And there he goes through a good method of learning how to take in more at a time. But that's the idea, is you want to just widen the gaze, widen the focus, so you can take in more words at once.
Mhm.
You can take in half a line at a time. And so you can get to the point where you can very comfortably read 500 to 1,000 words a minute.
Mhm.
To go more than 1,000 words a minute, you have to learn to read whole paragraphs at a time. So it's called nonlinear reading. It can be practiced and it can be attained, but I think it's never been my goal. It seems to me that once you can read over 500 words a minute, reading most books, especially novels, becomes like watching a movie. You're just able to, it can unfold more or less in real time as you're going through it. And then reading nonfiction books just becomes like a conversation that you're just able to follow the course of the conversation. And so I think more about, like, it's good that people learn to practice these things of reading, just to see, boy, a small amount of effort just to like take in more than 1 word at a time can suddenly
Mhm.
mean you're reading like twice as fast without rushing. And the faster you read in this way, what happens is, as you take in more at once, you're able to just, like, the words end up more and more not mattering. You're just getting the ideas. And you're able to then start to read at the speed of thought. And also that you stop vocalizing in your head everything you read. And you're able to get the meaning without using your auditory cortex by imaginatively saying it in your head. Now, you don't want to stamp that out, because that's probably always going to happen, that there's some vocalizing going on in the head as you're reading things. You don't rely on that to give you the understanding of what you're reading, but you learn to do that using just the visual cortex.
Yeah.
Does it make sense? Does that sound
Yeah,
crazy?
I
But
was actually gonna bring up that last point of repeating the words and reading the words in your head, that you repeat every single word in your head, and that kind of keeps you reading 1 word at a time. I think
yeah,
maybe one of the reasons people do that is because they don't wanna miss anything.
yeah.
Perhaps
There's
I mean, I'm sure there's a skill there too, but it's like, I wanna read every single word this person says, or this in this book. Otherwise, I don't know, I'll either miss an idea, or I feel like I haven't actually read the book
exactly.
unless I do that, or whatever.
I think people misunderstand how you remember what you read.
Mhm.
So it has nothing to do, like, if you're talking, it has nothing to do with intensity. It's more about geography. Okay, so you have to know the lay of the land, and know where things fit in. Then your memory has an easy time of it, and you can remember then the overall structure. See, but if you don't have that sense of where you are in a work, in an argument, in a scene, then it's very hard to remember it.
Mhm.
So I think it's a kind of a subtle point, but people will try to fixate and say in their head certain words as if by intensely doing that they're going to remember it better. But in fact, it's by understanding it more completely, understanding the overall idea, understanding how it fits into the whole. That's what allows you to remember it later.
Mhm.
Understanding leads to effortless memory. So, like, if you're in a good conversation, you came to understand what a person was saying, you could repeat the whole thing to someone else.
Yeah.
And that wasn't by trying to memorize what the person is saying as they say it. I mean, that would be impossible. But instead, you try to deeply understand what they're saying until you get it from the inside out. And then you know, and then you can remember it much
Mhm.
better.
Yeah. I mean, you can reproduce it
Exactly.
because you understand the logic behind it. And
Yeah, so you have to let go of, like, intensity of focus as a way of trying to remember things or imprint it in your memory, and instead let go, abandon that. Just understand deeply what you're reading,
Mhm.
and that means thinking of the whole context. So another thing people to really remember what they read, what they have to do is, I would say, get rid of the idea of, this is particularly for nonfiction, of reading a book from start to finish. In a way, there's no way you could remember all of that because you're just going to get a string of words, running across your awareness that just goes on for maybe 100,000 words. So, like, that's way too much to remember. What you need to do is, the first time you get the book, you go to the table of contents and you try to understand the breakdown, of how this book, what are the parts? And usually there's going to be 3 to 5 parts, overall. And then you understand how those are broken down. When you get to a chapter, the first thing you do in a chapter is you scan it to see the breakdown. This is if you want to remember everything in it. And then you see, okay, there's like 3 buckets here, and then you're able to relatively assess the importance of each bucket and what it's doing. And then you go through and read it. It might take, it might not be until the third pass that you're really now going through everything. But if you do it that way, what you've done is you've created a certain, you could say, a geography, or you've created certain buckets for your memory. And now it's easy to remember how things fit together. So you just have to, that requires a little bit of a different approach though, and so it's about geography, not about intensity. That's how you remember.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, I really like all this topic of how to read better, because I think one of the dangers of think being reading like too much is that the themes that you're reading about, whether it's ideals or heroism or relationships or whatever, they just become like concepts in your head. They're just ideas. And so I think the ultimate point of reading, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is actually to live better. So we want to make sure that
Hmm.
whatever we're reading is then reflected in our actions. So this is kind of a cool starting point of thinking as we're reading. Okay, but how are we striving to read better? So that's already
Hmm.
setting us along that path, which is great.
And
Um,
I think what that's like, actually, there's a very deep point too that, just to follow what you're saying of, um, that reading could be left brained or right brained.
mhm,
Like, left brained would be that you're just living in your own world and you've constructed your model of reality and you're living vicariously. And in a sense, you're neglecting the actual, like, real things in your life.
mhm,
And it could be a form of escapism then.
mhm,
But I think what we're talking about here is, engaging great minds in conversation, or even just reading great stories, from fiction. I think that what the real payoff of good reading is then you can have really deep conversations with others, your friends, the people you love, the people you're closest to. What you read ends up enriching those conversations. So you get to give them your reaction to it. You get to present the ideas to them. They get to, raise their own questions, about it. And that makes you then more deeply try to understand it when you go back to read it the next time.
mhm,
So there's something about it's like lighting the kind of spark in the intellect. That is one of the best ways of them being able to spark friendships and to deepen bonds, that you have a richness now to talk about. So many, I feel like, bonds suffer because people simply don't have enough to talk about.
mm,
But it's because I think there's a deficit in like the depth of reading. And it's not just about, I think, reporting like the facts of the news and things that day, but I think it's really coming like, what's a deeper take, on the issues that we're facing. And that leads to then really, I think, deeper, better conversations where the bond gets really then deeply built. So the best motive for reading is actually to have you have these great conversations with great minds who wrote the books, so you can
Mhm.
have deeper conversations with those who are closest to you.
Well, Kevin, I think that's a great note to end on, and we're actually out of time at this point. So I don't know if you have any final thoughts you want to add on top of that.
Only that if a person reads, this is a fun fact, if you read basically 15 minutes a day, which I think is a good minimum, uh, and you read 250 words a minute, you'd read about 14, 15 books a year. The average, when American adults have been asked, how many books have you read since college? The most common answer was zero. It was amazing. So, but just doing 15 minutes a day is like 15 books a year. If you double your reading speed, which you can do with just a little bit of working at it, then there'd be 30 books a year. You read for 30 minutes a day, then there'd be 60 books a year. So it does you can actually very quickly build up a great deal of skills and learning and knowledge, just by this regular habit of reading. And you definitely see improvements, I think, in all areas of life.
Absolutely. It's worth it. Okay, Kevin. Well, thanks so much.
Thanks, Sharif.
We'll be back next week. Well, thanks so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Don't forget to check out OptimalWork.com for a set of online tools to help you engage challenge in your life. See you next week.